So today we're going to be doing this cute little wren. Now this project is probably going to be a 2-week project, but we're going to be doing this a little bit the opposite. So instead of inking first, we're actually going to be doing a lot of wet on wet watercolor, and then we're going to be inking next week. And we're going to do a little bit of like regular ink, and then we're also, for like a lot of these spots, we're going to come back with some white ink or like a white paint pen. Now you could mask these areas off if you really wanted to, but I think it's a lot more fun to kind of go back with the white, because then you can make it a little more painterly and have a little more fun with it. And we're going to use a little bit of non-traditional colors for this, like some of our shadows. Instead of just doing browns, we're going to end up doing like purple and yellow, but we'll get to that in a minute. So, because what we're going to do first is we're going to start drawing directly onto our watercolor paper, just to keep it nice and loose. And when you draw directly onto your watercolor paper, you want to use a really light pencil, like a 6H or a 2H, just because like if you use like a 2B or something like that, then it's going to leave a lot of graphite on there. Another option is some people like to use like water soluble pencils, or there's watercolor pencils, things like that. You could use that instead. I know some people have some of those. So yeah, now one thing to think about when you're drawing birds is you want to look for your main shapes. So like for the wren, I really see kind of a circle. It's a very like small kind of circular bird, not like the whole entire shape is a circle, but more so if you look from like the bottom to there, it's very circular. And then the head is a little bit more like an oval. They don't have very much of a neck. It's like very squished. So what I'm going to do first is I'm lightly going to draw kind of a circle. Now that doesn't mean that I'm going to have a super round bird. It's not going to stay like that exactly, but this is just a starting point. And then from there, I'm going to have kind of that squatty oval shape. And you want to look at how the head lines up to the body. So this is the beginning of the head, and this is where the head ends. You can see how the head kind of starts in almost, a little bit less than the middle, almost exactly the middle. So that's about where I want my head to be. And then once I have those main shapes, then I'm going to start looking at the angles. So angles are like, even though we said this is like a round circle, if I hold my pencil up against the bird, okay, then I see a slight change in angle compared to the pencil. So then I would come in and angle them a little bit. But I'm not even worried about the face. I'm just looking at like the outer contour. And then the beak, you can see how with birds, a lot of times their beaks come into their face a little bit. So I don't want to have it just sticking out from the front of the face. It's going to be coming in a little bit. And it is a little pointy. I'm sure it has something evolutionary to do with what they eat. I forget what wrens eat. I'm sure Kathy can tell us. And then the back of their tail is very pointy. Kind of like that. So we're going to start off with our simple shapes, and then we'll start getting a little bit more detailed and then once you have like the base, then I can start looking more at the details of the wren. So one big thing about the wren that's kind of funny is if you look at like from the tips of the wings to the tail, you have almost like a little triangle. So looking for that space helps you to know if you have your wings and your tail in the right area. And also it helps us to know how long the wings are going to be. So, because this is kind of a small bird, so most of the features are going to be kind of proportioned a little smaller than we would think of like, an eagle or a hawk. It's a small bird. So I'm going to go ahead and I think I need to move my tail up a little bit just when I'm looking at where my tail lines up to the rest of my body. So that's why you want to draw very lightly on your watercolor paper, just in case you need to make any changes to that. I'm going to try and erase this. So, and then from there, I'm going to have just the edge of the wing, and then the little baby wing over there. And then the legs, I would just look at kind of the angles of the legs like sticks and try and figure out that shape before I start adding too much details to them. And then our eye is pretty close to the beak and it's pretty round. So I would start off with like a circle. And for this painting, since we're gonna be a little loose, you don't have to make the eye super detailed. And so this is just on a piece of paper. I already drew my Wren on a separate piece of watercolor paper, and I put probably more detail than I necessarily needed, where I put lots of like little dashes for feathers and things like that. I probably will completely cover over that when I do the painting part. Then underneath the bird, rather than doing like this little wood stump, I would do a branch instead. It's a little more fun. And then if you don't like your feet, you can always put leaves in front of it. Now, before we start painting our bird, we're gonna be practicing a little bit of the wet on wet technique we're gonna be using for our bird. So now for your practice, I would draw 2 circles on a scrap piece of watercolor paper. You can draw it yourself, or you could trace like a piece of tape, like, you know, circle piece of tape, or a cup or something like that. And we're gonna be mixing up some colors on our palette. Now, you don't have to do the exact same colors you're gonna do for your bird. We're probably gonna do one that's like random colors and one that's close to our bird's colors. So on my palette, I'm going to take yellow ochre with a lot of water.
What size brush are you using?
I would use an 8 or a 10 size brush, since we're doing a lot of big area. So this is yellow ochre. Technically this is my Naples yellow, but it's the only thing I have close to yellow ochre. And I can always tone it down with just like a little bit of brown, like burnt sienna. And I'm gonna make a really watery pile of that. And then in another puddle, I'm going to mix burnt sienna. And this is gonna be with less water.
So did you put some Naples in the yellow ochre?
All I had was Naples, so this is basically my substitute for yellow ochre.
Gotcha.
Yeah. And then we want to mix a purple. So purple you can mix with alizarin and ultramarine, or if you have like a dioxazine purple, that one's also good. And then the last color will be Payne's gray and a little bit of burnt sienna. Once you have your bird colors mixed, then we're also gonna have some crazy bird colors, which can be whatever colors you want. So, like, I can mix some viridian green. I could get phthalo blue. I like blue a lot. So just making big. Now we're gonna be practicing our wet on wet method. So the first, I'm gonna use my crazy colors, which aren't super crazy. I have phthalo blue and viridian. And basically what we're gonna practice is wetting with just a bit of water the entire circle. And when you're trying to fill a round object like this, it's best to curve your brush strokes and have them touch each other. Like that. And then while it's wet, then you're gonna take, I'm just gonna take some phthalo blue and I'm going to drop it in. And then I'll take my phthalo blue. This was Viridian, and then I'm taking phthalo blue and I'm just gonna drop it in right on top. Now you can see how wherever I drop in the color on top of another color, they're going to bleed together. And since the paper is wet, it's also going to bleed. So we're not trying to make it look smooth. We're trying to create that kind of texture. And then if I wanted this to look like a 3D like circle, then I would want to take a darker blue, since most of this is blue, and tap that on the bottom while it's wet. Because when your paint or paper is really wet like this, if you want to add more to it, you have to make sure you're using less water. Because if I keep trying to take more water and like, oh, I want to fix that, then, yep, exactly. All you're doing is blossoming and you're pushing that paint away. So I can do that on purpose if I want different texture. Like when we get to our bird, we can always do that to make a little more ruffly kind of texture. But if you're trying to darken an area, then you want to use more paint. Okay, so play around with that one. And then for the second one, we're going to be using the actual colors we're going to use for our bird. Turn my circle into a bird just, by dragging up some of my blue and then going back in with more paint to darken areas. And then we can always add more details to it for fun with inking. Now for our second one, we're gonna be using more of the colors that are of the actual bird. So for that one, what we're gonna do is instead of wetting with just water, we're actually going to be wetting using the yellow ochre. So since the yellow ochre is already pretty watered down, it's a great base to use to kind of tone the whole entire bird. So what I'm going to do is fill my entire circle with my yellow ochre. And then to create a shadow, I'm going to wash off my brush a little bit and use the purple at the bottom of my circle. And what this is going to do, it's going to look like, whoa, that does not look like a bird color at all. But what's going to happen is the yellow and the purple will mix to kind of create an interesting brown. Now, if yours isn't mixing very much, you can always tap some more yellow on top of it. And then for the top of the bird, we're going to come in with our burnt sienna, which, this is still just a practice blob. It's okay if it doesn't look like a bird. And then if I wanted to make it look like a bird, I could take my really dark color and use that to kind of give it a little funny head. I could give it a little wing. And then once it dries, we can always add like a little bit of inking. And then do little feet. So now we're gonna put our practice birds off to the side and get our drawn wren onto our paper. Now we're gonna do the same steps we did with our second practice bird, but now since we have our drawing underneath, we have a little bit more structure to our bird. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna start with a layer of yellow ochre because that's a lot of the yellow undertones we see in the bird. And then burnt sienna is in a lot of the wings, some of the shadows on the body, and also purple. And our last color, which was that Payne's Gray and Burnt Sienna is for the darkest shadows. So like the top of the bird's head, things like that. Things like the eye and the beak, we're not too worried about if you accidentally paint it over, because we're gonna be going back and darkening them with Payne's Gray anyway. So I'm using a number 10 paintbrush. You can always use a little bit smaller depending on how big your bird is. So you can see this just helps me to be able to drop in a lot of paint at one time. And what I'm gonna do is I'm grabbing my yellow ochre and I'm going to be painting my entire bird. I'm not really worried about the feet or anything like that. So I'm painting the entire thing. And then while it's wet, I'm gonna go in and grab my purple. And since purple and yellow are complementary, they're going to kind of mix at the bottom and make an interesting color. So we're going, a little loosey-goosey. So if your purple is just staying there, it's not really mixing enough with your yellow, I can always come back, grab more yellow and overlap it. So see how that kind of mixed the paint and also kind of pushed it a little bit? So I'm not gonna touch down here anymore just because it's really wet. And now I'm gonna start adding the browns to the upper part of the bird. So this is my burnt sienna. And I'm just dropping it in up top. If you can go around the eye, you can, or it's okay if you drop it back in. And any white, we can always put back in with the white pen. I'm gonna put some brown over here. And then with my darker color, which is that really, really dark Payne's Gray and brown mixture, I'm gonna drop that in on the top of my bird's head, on the bottom of the wing, and also on the tip of my wing because it's pretty dark. Now, if you have any awkward lines where things stop and you really want them to blend, that's where I can just drag it with a little bit of water. We can tap in between colors, and then I'm just gonna let this layer dry. You don't wanna fiddle with it too much. This is a stage where if I wanna add anything else, then I would want to grab more paint, because if I add more water, then you're gonna end up with those kind of blossoms. So you can make purposeful blossoms where you take a brush with just a little bit of water and you just tap it in. You can kind of see it doing something, not much, but that's gonna be our first wet on wet layer. And then next, what you could do is just take a little bit of Payne's Gray to fill the beak, just because I didn't put anything in there yet. So I'm gonna take a little watered down Payne's Gray and just block in my beak. Now, if I wanted it to fade into the other painted areas, then I would just drag it with a little bit of water. Like that, so it looks like it's blending in. And then the feet, I would take your burnt sienna and do a really light layer. And then we can just drop in some of our darker brown for the shadows. So, and last thing with the paint would be just to do like the branch. So that we want just very watery. And I would just do that also with burnt sienna. Or you can make it covered in green. Like sometimes I'll do a layer of brown, and then on the top, I could take like sap green and drop it in on the very top. And then the final parts I want to do with paint is I could come back in and do more layers with the same colors. And sometimes if you work on your painting and maybe it started to dry a little bit, then you could always use a little bit of water to blend it. But if it's really wet, then you may have to wait or use a lot of paint. So like I can come back in and add more purple if I want some more shadows. And then next time we're going to talk about how you can start adding inking to your bird to add a little bit more depth, because that's going to help us to start creating some of the feathers. We're going to be using like a micron black pen and a paint marker. Or if you don't like to use like paint markers, you could use white gouache or even white acrylic instead. So now that I'm done with the wet on wet watercolor technique on my bird, now I'm gonna start adding more structure to my bird by using an ink pen. Now I'm using a micron pen, which is like a waterproof pen. You can also do this type of inking before you paint since it is waterproof. So I'm using a 005 just because that's what I had. It's like the smallest one they have. But you could always use like an 01 or an 02. And what I'm going to start with is first trying to establish the main shape of my bird. So birds are a little fluffy. They have a little bit of feathers to them. So what I'm going to do is come along the edge, and I'm not like perfectly outlining the bird. I'm trying to just incorporate and use the watercolor, just kind of embracing what direction it went. So if it went a little outside my lines, that's perfectly fine. I can just ink it a little bit, and that's gonna make it look like it's part of the painting. And then the beak is gonna be pretty smooth. My feathers, I want to be a little more frazzled. And I'm just kind of lightly sketching where I can still see my pencil lines. But if you lost a lot of your pencil lines, it's okay. You can always look at your photo reference just to make it up. I'm gonna go and do the little dashes to make his head a little fluffy. And I'm gonna fill in the nostril a little bit. Now for the eye, I'm going to outline the eye with my ink pen, and I could either fill it in with Payne's gray, or I could actually use the ink pen to fill it in. So if I do that, I would do back and forth lines where I go in one direction and then go in the other direction to do cross hatching. And I'm gonna try and leave a little dot for its eye. And that's where I'm gonna use my paint marker. And this one I just found on Amazon. It came as like a set. You can also buy, like, I think Sharpie makes a white paint pen. I don't like it as much as this one. And see, then I do a little white dot in the bird's eye. I'm also gonna use the white for the little spots that are on the bird. Has some little lines. So see all those cute little spots it has? And then I could also use it for flicking out where the Wren has white fur. Now sometimes what's cool about this pen is it is water soluble, so you can actually smear it or spread it with water while it's still wet. Oops, just a little bit. But it will, you know, get a little chalky. So I try not to do it too much. And then there's some white right above the eye. Little tufts over here. I could use it for highlights, like on the feet. And then for a little more texture on the wings, I have like the lines I've drawn, and then I could also do like little dashes, like little lines like this to add even more texture. Especially on like the chest of the bird, we want it to feel really fluffy. So if my watercolor doesn't seem very fluffy, this really helps. And then I'm going to outline my little feet. Oops, I actually moved the nail a little bit. All right, and then that's about it for my Wren. Now you could always ink more than I did, or you could always do less. Like maybe you don't want to do any white. If I wanted more, you know, I could do more shading and overlap on top of my watercolor more, or I could try and keep it pretty loose.